He let the eighth of her desperate calls ring out, sending it to his virtual assistant while, 7 months pregnant, a crushing pressure seized her chest and her vision began to blur. The phone slipped from her trembling hand as she crumpled to the floor. A choked gasp, the only sound in the cavernous penthouse, as the tiny life she had so fiercely
Today
protected
marks a
was
monumental
suddenly
achievement for
in
everyone
peril.
involved.
He
Our
saw
initial
every
public offering is
notification.
just the beginning of a
He
new
read
era
every
of innovation
text.
and growth.
He
As you can
watched the
see,
words,
shell corporations
Ellie
are layered
Hospital the
here and
Baby,
here.
But where is the
scroll
money
across
actually
the
going?
face of his luxury
That's what the
watch.
offshore accounts
Then,
obscure.
Yeah.
he
Did you
swiped
confess
the
to the
alert
police?
away,
To the camera, are
leaned
you
in
guilty?
closer to his head of acquisitions, and gestured for
How
the
does your wife
server
feel
to
about
refill
this?
their champagne. The last name she whispered, before the world faded to black, was his. But Arthur Lexington wasn't halfway across the world closing a deal in Dubai. He was an hour away at a polo match in the Hamptons. What followed was a masterclass in demolition. Because the pregnant wife he abandoned wasn't just a socialite, she was the award-winning architect who had designed his entire empire. And her godfather was a man who'd built a legendary career as the most feared corporate investigator in New York. When Eleanor pieced together the full scope of Arthur's betrayal, his affair, and the staggering fraud that was the true foundation of his company, she didn't break down, she didn't make a scene, she began to draft new blueprints. This is the story of how a betrayed wife and her brilliant godfather systematically raised the kingdom of every single person who threatened her child. And I promise you, by the time the dust settles, you will be on your feet and cheering. Stick around for the finale. The retribution is absolute. And if this story ignites that same fire in your own spirit, I would be incredibly honored if you would click that subscribe button. Share your reactions with us below and join our community so you never miss a single detail of what's to come. Let us begin. 4 months later, on a crisp autumn evening in Manhattan, the soaring glass ceilings of the Metropolitan Museum of Art glittered down on the city's annual real estate gala. Eleanor Vance stood near a marble sculpture, the very picture of unshakable grace. Her expression was calm, her gaze steady, her entire presence radiating a quiet, formidable strength. She wore a severe but stunning emerald green gown, a dress that spoke of old money and immense power. Her dark hair was styled in a sleek, commanding chignon. Not a single strand was out of place. To any onlooker, she was the image of the loyal, adoring wife. But underneath that placid exterior, a cold, calculated fury was being honed to the sharpness of a scalpel. The voice of her husband, Arthur, echoed from the stage, his speech full of hollow phrases about legacy, vision, and building the future. Eleanor had stopped believing in Arthur's vision of the future 4 months ago, on a night of sheer terror, when she nearly died alone while he was at a business summit in a seaside resort with his mistress. Now, at the gala intended to celebrate his company's crowning achievement, the acquisition of a landmark property, she was about to trigger its spectacular implosion. Eleanor allowed herself a fleeting private smile, not of pleasure, but of finality. A debt was about to be collected in its entirety. Her own words, forged in the sterile quiet of a hospital's cardiac unit, came back to her. They tell you a betrayal of that magnitude will shatter you. But it didn't shatter me. It reminded me of what I could build. And the people who nearly took my daughter from me are about to discover that I am my godfather's goddaughter. And my godfather never, ever misjudges a building's breaking point. Arthur finished his speech to a roar of applause. Financial reporters began shouting questions. Eleanor didn't register the sound. Her focus was fixed upon two figures celebrating under the spotlights: her husband, Arthur Lexington, and his mistress, Savannah Cole, his head of acquisitions, standing proudly and possessively by his side. She could already see their future headlines: Arthur Lexington, indicted in a sweeping racketeering and wire fraud case. Savannah Cole, career destroyed, facing conspiracy charges. Justice served with architectural precision. But that was the destination. To understand how Eleanor Vance was transformed from an expectant, loving mother-to-be into the wrecking ball of a real estate tycoon's life, we have to rewind. Back to a morning that began like any other. Back to a life that appeared perfect to the world, but was constructed upon a mountain of deceit. 4 months earlier, the New York City skyline was a wall of gray against the glass. It was the kind of chill that seeped through even the floor-to-ceiling windows of their penthouse overlooking Central Park. Eleanor Vance moved through the stark, white kitchen with the slow, deliberate steps of her third trimester. Her entire existence had been refined to a single purpose: protecting the precious life growing within her. It was a high-risk pregnancy, a fact that made every single day a campaign of careful monitoring. On the expansive marble countertop, a fetal heart rate monitor sat next to a line of prescription vitamins. She placed a hand over her belly, feeling the soft, reassuring flutter of a kick. A small life who was depending on her, and on a man who was rapidly becoming a stranger. She composed her features, pushing down the low-grade anxiety that had been her constant companion for months. She smoothed the fabric of her cashmere maternity dress, took a calming breath, and poured a glass of water. "Just a little longer, my sweet girl," she murmured. "We are almost at the finish line." The sharp, confident sound of expensive loafers on the marble floor announced him. Arthur Lexington appeared in the doorway, a human hurricane of forward momentum. He was already dressed in his daily battle armor, a $4,000 bespoke suit, no tie, and an expression of intense ambition. He was wearing a different aftershave, something she didn't recognize. He didn't look at her belly. His eyes barely grazed her as a person. His world was compressed into the glowing screen of his phone, his thumb a blur as he scrolled through secure messages. Eleanor watched him, a silent analyst in her own marriage, taking note of the small warnings she had been trying to ignore for months. The way his phone was always angled away from her. The faint, arrogant smile that played on his lips when he read certain texts. The complete emotional vacancy in his eyes when he finally did look at her. "My appointment with the cardiac specialist is at 3 o'clock this afternoon," Eleanor stated, her voice even. "I really need you to be there with me this time." Arthur didn't look up. "The final contracts for the Dubai Tower are being executed today. I cannot just abandon a $2 billion deal for a routine checkup." "He said it was critical for you to be there." At that, he finally looked at her, his gaze icy. The passionate, driven man she had married was gone, replaced by this ruthless CEO. "Someone has to fund this entire enterprise, Eleanor. That includes the team of top-tier doctors you insisted upon. Or have you forgotten how a 9-figure payroll works?" The insult struck its target with surgical precision. Eleanor absorbed the blow, a familiar ache spreading through her chest. She had put a celebrated career as a star architect on hold. She had tabled her own ambitions to support his, to create the stable home for the family they had both claimed to desperately want. And now he used that decision as a cudgel. Arthur grabbed his briefcase from the counter. He didn't lean in to kiss her. He didn't place a hand on her belly. He offered not a single word of recognition for the child that was supposed to be their shared destiny. "Arthur," she tried again, her voice softening. "Please, he's going to review the delivery protocol. It's getting very real." For a fleeting second, something of the old Arthur seemed to flicker in his eyes. A hint of genuine care, maybe. Then it was gone, walled off behind the familiar facade of relentless ambition. "You can give me the highlights tonight. I am building a dynasty for this family, Eleanor. You should try to comprehend the scale of what I'm doing." He strode out. The heavy front door swung closed, its electronic lock engaging with a soft but final click. Eleanor was left standing in the ringing silence of their perfect home. Her hands found their way back to her belly in a protective embrace. A question she had been repressing for months rose up with a sickening certainty. Was this baby a part of his dynasty, or just another asset to burnish his brand? She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to force the thought away. "Your father loves us," she whispered to her womb, the words feeling brittle and hollow. "He's just under an immense amount of pressure. He is building something incredible for all of us." The lie felt like swallowing sand. But what was the alternative? That the man she had built her world around now viewed their own child as an inconvenience? That his perfect family was just another slide in his presentation to foreign investors? She shook her head, clinging to the desperate hope that she was overreacting. "I love you," she promised the child inside her. "I love you more than anything on this earth." She had no way of knowing that in less than 12 hours, that love would face its most vicious test. The afternoon light was fading to a bruised purple over the city when the first crushing pain radiated through her chest. It was sudden, breathtaking, and utterly wrong. She cried out, clutching the edge of the granite countertop to stay upright. A disorienting wave of dizziness washed over her. Her doctor's urgent warnings about the warning signs of severe preeclampsia screamed in her mind. Another contraction gripped her, this one sharper, stealing the air from her lungs. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed Arthur's number. It rang endlessly before an automated voice took over. She tried again. Voicemail. A chill that had nothing to do with the Chicago wind settled into her bones. She typed out a text. "Something is terribly wrong. Call me." Then another. "Arthur, please. The baby. Hospital." She was a prisoner in their penthouse, a gilded cage overlooking the city, and the one person who swore to protect her was gone. A wave of panic washed over her. She had to reach his project manager, his assistant, anyone. His leather briefcase was sitting on a chair in his home studio where he'd left it. Moving with deliberate care, each step an effort, she made her way to it. As she rummaged inside for a business card, a folded receipt from a jeweler fluttered onto the Persian rug. It was for a custom emerald necklace, described in lavish detail. A knot of dread tightened in her stomach. She plugged the jeweler's name and the piece into her laptop. There it was, on a society blog. A photo from a charity gala last week. Arthur, beaming, his arm draped around the shoulders of Isabella Rossi, the real estate mogul. And around Isabella's neck was the emerald necklace. The photo's caption was time-stamped just last night. He wasn't at a late-night concrete pour for his new skyscraper. He was in the city with his mistress. The betrayal was a physical blow, more painful than the cramps seizing her womb. She stared at the screen, at the image of him at an event he'd claimed was a tedious investor dinner, and her perfectly curated world began to splinter and collapse. All the vague excuses, the business trips that ran through weekends, the unfamiliar scent of perfume clinging to his coats, it all came crashing down in one devastating moment. While she stared at the photograph, another brutal wave of pain tore through her. She glanced down and saw a dark crimson stain spreading across the fabric of her silk lounge pants. Her obstetrician's final stern warning echoed in her mind. "Any significant bleeding, Eleanor, you do not wait. You call 911 immediately." With the digital proof of her husband's deceit glowing on the screen in front of her, she finally, with a shaking finger, dialed the 3 numbers that would save her life and shatter his. His voice was kind, yet serious. "You are an exceptionally strong woman, Mrs. Vance, but your body is doing the work of 2 right now. and this level of stress is a genuine danger. You have to promise me you'll call the instant you feel any serious cramping, any bleeding. Will you do that for me?" Eleanor nodded, her hand resting over her belly in a protective gesture. "I'll call?" "Wonderful," the doctor said with a gentle smile, reviewing her chart. "We'll schedule you for next week. Until then, I implore you, find a way to get some rest." Eleanor thanked him, buttoned her coat, and stepped out of the clinic onto Michigan Avenue, into the biting Chicago wind. A storm was brewing over the lake. Her phone buzzed. A text from Arthur. "The Citadel Tower pour is a mess. Going to be here all night. Don't wait up." She deleted it without replying. That night, Eleanor moved through their Gold Coast apartment with a strange, deliberate calm, as if some primal instinct knew her quiet life was on the verge of imploding. She took a warm bath, careful of her swollen belly. She changed into a soft cashmere nightgown. She sat in the nearly completed nursery, stroking her own hair and whispering to the child growing inside her. Her gaze fell on a shelf filled with classic children's stories. "Which one will it be tonight, little one?" Eleanor mused with a faint smile. "The one about the little engine that could." She pulled the well-worn book from its place. They had read it together countless times, but Eleanor never tired of it. A story about perseverance, about overcoming impossible odds through sheer will. She read the tale aloud, her voice a steady, calming whisper in the vast, empty apartment. She savored every word, feeling the baby's gentle shifts against her hand. When she finished, a heavy silence filled the room, the distant wail of a siren providing a mournful soundtrack to the beat of her own heart. "Mommy," she whispered to her belly, voicing a fear she barely dared to acknowledge. "Are you going to be all right?" The question hung in the still air. She leaned forward, pressing her cheek against her own skin. "You're the toughest little fighter I know," she murmured, "and we fighters never, ever give up." A small, determined kick answered her, and she smiled, closing her eyes for a moment, watching the city lights of Chicago sparkle through the evening haze. An hour or two later, Eleanor was in Arthur's home office, straightening a stack of blueprints when she saw it. A notification lit up their shared family tablet, which was synced to all his devices. It was an alert from his high-end rideshare app, a simple trip receipt. Drop-off, the Elysian Residences, Penthouse B, time-stamped for 10:45 p.m. tonight. Her blood ran cold. She had braced herself for a surge of rage, for a gut-wrenching shock. Instead, there was only a hollow, icy certainty. Some part of her had known for months. Some part of her had felt the distance between them growing into an impassable gulf. Eleanor stared at the receipt for a long time. Then, with a slow, precise movement, she closed the tablet's cover. She could not break down now. Not yet. Not with the storm raging over the lake and her son sleeping inside her. She could not process the end of her marriage while she was preparing for the beginning of her family. "Tomorrow," she promised herself, "I will face this tomorrow." But the tomorrow she envisioned was never meant to be, because in less than 3 hours, Eleanor Vance's entire world would be ripped apart, and nothing would ever be the same. The thing that woke Eleanor at 1:17 a.m. was not the sound of the wind screaming off the lake, but a sudden blinding pain that tore through her, followed by a terrifying rush of fluid. A contraction, like a band of steel, tightened from deep inside. Her water had just broken. Her bare feet slipped on the cold marble floor as she stumbled towards the ensuite bathroom. The woman in the mirror made her heart stop. Blood. She was only 32 weeks along. This was far too early. The baby. Her hands flew to her belly, her eyes wide with terror. The massive apartment seemed to groan as a fierce gust of wind slammed against the windows, a mournful howl in the night. My son, Eleanor fumbled for her phone, cradling her abdomen, feeling the weak, frantic kicks from within. He was fighting, but something was deeply, terribly wrong. She snatched her phone from the nightstand, her fingers shaking so badly she could hardly press Arthur's name. It went straight to his assistant. She tried again. Voicemail. A third time. Voicemail. She switched to text messages, her thumbs clumsy on the screen. Water broke. Am bleeding. Going to Northwestern. Please hurry. The status changed immediately. Delivered. Then, a few seconds later, read at 1:24 a.m. There was no reply. Eleanor had no time to absorb the sheer cruelty of his silence. She dialed 911, her voice sounding unnervingly calm as she gave the operator their address and her situation. The dispatcher urged her to remain calm, to lie on her left side, and that paramedics were on their way. She held her belly, rocking back and forth, whispering the same words like a prayer. Stay with me, my little one. Mommy is right here. Help is coming. You're such a tough little fighter. Stay with me. Please, just stay with me. The baby fluttered inside her, a weak, panicked movement. Her lips formed a word she could barely say out loud. Daddy. He's on his way, my love, Eleanor lied, hot tears carving tracks down her cheeks. Daddy's on his way. But Daddy was not on his way. 80 floors up, in a penthouse suite. At the Elysian, Arthur Vance was tangled in 1,000-thread-count sheets with a woman who was not his wife. Isabella was everything Eleanor was not: sharp, ambitious, and utterly free of the gentle vulnerability of impending motherhood. Her lean body was draped over Arthur's, her perfectly manicured nails tracing lazy circles on his chest. Arthur's personal phone buzzed on the bedside table, and again, and a third time. Isabella reached for it, her movement fluid as she glanced at the screen. She saw the name. She saw the word hospital. She's texting again, Isabella said softly, holding the phone so Arthur could see. It says it's an emergency. Arthur barely cracked his eyes open. He'd heard this tune before. Eleanor's perpetual anxiety. Her doctor had called the pregnancy high risk, and since that day, she had worried about every single cramp. She's so dramatic, he muttered, his voice heavy with sleep. She imagines these things. She works herself into a state over nothing. She worries about every little ache and pain. But the text says she's bleeding, Isabella observed, with a cool, detached interest. Maybe you should call her. Arthur reached over and silenced the phone, placing it face down. If it was a real emergency, her doctor would have called me. She knows I have this waterfront deal closing tonight. Isabella accepted this with a slight shrug. She had not thought much about the baby. Children were messy, inconvenient drains on money and attention that she believed were better invested elsewhere. She snuggled back against Arthur, running a hand across his stomach. You're probably right, she purred. She's just being needy. Now, where were we? Arthur smiled and pulled her closer, and 80 floors below, across a storm-ravaged city, his child was fighting for his life. The first contraction hit her at 10 minutes to midnight, sharp and wrong. It felt like a betrayal. Julian was in Palo Alto, he'd said, closing a series of late-night funding rounds. He wasn't answering her texts. She called a car service, her hand protectively cradling her stomach as she descended in the elevator of their penthouse. The journey to the medical center was a blur of San Francisco's empty, fog-slicked streets. The rhythmic swipe of the windshield wipers, a maddening metronome counting down the seconds. Alara stared out at the dark bay, whispering to her unborn son, telling him to be strong, that Mommy was here, that everything would be okay. But the ache was too deep. The spotting she'd seen was too much. This wasn't right. She stumbled through the automatic doors of the emergency room at 12:17 a.m. A swarm of scrubs and white coats converged on her, their voices a flurry of clinical terms that washed over her in a wave of terror. A registrar tried to ask for her insurance information, her medical history, but the words wouldn't form. "My baby, please, just help my baby." A nurse, older, with kind wrinkles around her eyes, took her hand firmly. "We're going to take the very best care of you," she promised, her voice a steady anchor in the storm. "But we have to move you to surgery right now. We have to act immediately. Do you consent?" Alara could only manage a choked nod. The truth, a shard of ice in her throat. An overwhelming coldness seeped into her bones as they rushed her down a long, sterile hall, past gleaming equipment and the hushed, urgent movements of the night staff. She tried Julian's phone one last time. Voicemail. She sent a final, desperate text, her thumb shaking. "Julian, please. I'm at the hospital. Something is wrong with Oliver. Please call me." She waited. She bargained with God. She pleaded with a silent universe to just let her son be safe. At 12:49 a.m., the anesthesiologist placed a mask over her face. An endless, high-pitched drone was the sound that woke her. It was a sound that would echo in the silence of her loneliest nights for the rest of her life. When she slowly blinked her eyes open, her obstetrician was standing by the bed, his face a grim tableau of professional sorrow. He didn't have to say a word. Alara could already feel the hollow, aching void where her son had been. "Mrs. Croft," he began, his voice gentle, "I am so profoundly sorry. We did everything we could." Alara's legs felt like they were cast in iron beneath the crisp hospital linens. She pushed herself up and swung them over the side of the bed, her body numb, until her bare feet met the cold floor. A raw, guttural sound tore from her throat, an animal cry of loss that echoed down the quiet hallway. Her Oliver, her perfect, hoped-for boy. He was gone. The San Francisco hospital room was silent as a tomb at 3 a.m. Alara sat motionless, clutching a tiny, gray knitted blanket the nurse had left for him. It had no scent. The family tablet on her bedside table lit up with a notification, not a message, but a calendar alert from Julian's synced account she rarely looked at. A new event had just concluded. The title, Project Nightingale Launch Dinner. The location tag showed a 3-star restaurant in Napa Valley. The guest list, Julian Croft and Sienna Vance, his head of engineering. The sterile white of the private suite felt like an accusation, a mockery of the darkness that had just consumed her life. She had picked up the tablet to search for bereavement therapists when the notification appeared. Sienna. With one tap, a new circle of hell opened up. It wasn't just the calendar event. A message preview from a luxury jeweler popped up on the screen. "Your custom necklace is ready, Mr. Croft." Engraving, "To our new beginning." Asterisk, a charge alert from the corporate card for a private suite at a Napa resort. And then a photo shared to his private cloud. Sienna, laughing, holding a champagne flute, a new diamond necklace sparkling at her throat. Alara's gaze locked onto the timestamps. They ran from 8 p.m. until well after midnight, the exact hours she had spent terrified and alone, losing their child. The sound she made wasn't a cry. It was the quiet, final snap of a heart breaking. He had ignored 12 texts and 4 phone calls while their son's tiny life slipped away. 12 chances to be a husband, a father, and he had chosen his project, his celebration, his mistress. In that moment, Alara's monumental grief began to transform, hardening into something cold, precise, and unbreakable. The chasm of her loss was still there, but a new foundation was being built inside it, one forged from pure, unyielding resolve. She looked at the little gray blanket the nurse had given her, the only thing she would ever hold of Oliver's. She folded it, with painstaking care, and tucked it into her purse. By the time Julian returned from his funding rounds, she would be ready. Julian Croft entered their Pacific Heights penthouse shortly after 11 in the morning, smelling faintly of expensive wine and foggy Napa air. He had his narrative polished, a sudden crisis with the venture capitalists, an all-night negotiation under a strict NDA that had saved the company. He stopped dead in the entryway. Alara was sitting in an armchair by the floor-to-ceiling windows, the morning fog over the Golden Gate turning her into a silhouette of grief. She was perfectly still, her hands resting on her stomach, now painfully, unnaturally flat. On the marble table beside her, the tablet was glowing. "Alara," Julian began, his voice a flawless performance of exhausted concern. "My God, I'm so sorry. The VCs were absolutely brutal. They made us lock our phones away. The meeting ran until dawn. By the time I could get a signal, I thought you'd be asleep. I didn't want to wake you." Alara said nothing. She simply watched him, her eyes as gray and empty as the fog outside, utterly devoid of the admiration he'd always taken for granted. He faltered, her silence disrupting his script. He had anticipated tears, accusations, an emotional storm he knew how to weather. "Is everything okay?" he asked, a trace of genuine confusion in his voice. "The baby? He's okay, right?" Alara finally turned her head, her voice a hollow echo in the vast silent room. "Oliver is gone. We lost him at 2:40 a.m., Julian." His handsome face contorted, the practiced concern giving way to a flicker of real shock. "What? I started having problems last night. I sent you 12 texts. I called you 4 times. My phone log shows every single one was delivered. Alara, my phone was in a secure lockbox. It was a condition of the meeting, I swear. I didn't get them until this morning. I thought the doctor said you just needed to take it easy. I thought he was going to be fine." Alara slowly reached out a finger and tapped the tablet screen, bringing up the synced calendar. It showed a vibrant entry for the previous night. Project Nightingale, launch dinner, the French Laundry, the private dining room, $20,000 for the evening, billed to the R&D budget. Julian's composure finally cracked. She could see panic warring with damage control in his eyes. The damage control won. It was for the board. We had to celebrate the launch to maintain investor confidence. Sienna had to be there to present the final schematics. "This is not what it looks like." She swiped again, bringing up the jeweler's email confirmation. Him confirming the engraving for a diamond necklace. "To our new beginning?" she asked, her voice entirely devoid of emotion. A heavy, suffocating silence filled the penthouse, a vacuum where his lies had finally run out of air. He said, his voice shifting into the patient, patronizing tone she now recognized as his most potent weapon. "You are in shock. You've suffered an unimaginable trauma, and you're looking for a target for your pain. I understand. We can talk about this when you're feeling more rational." Alara stood up. She felt as though she'd been carrying a great weight for years and had just set it down. "The nurse said, 'He had your eyes,'" she said, her voice quiet but razor-sharp. "She told me our son died while I was alone, calling for his father, and you were buying diamonds and toasting a new beginning with another woman." Julian took an involuntary step back, as if she had physically struck him. He had never seen this expression on her face before. It was calm, appraising, and completely free of fear. "Alara, please. You are not yourself. This grief is making you paranoid. Let me call your doctor. We can get through this together. Get out." The command was a whisper, but it sliced through the air like a surgeon's scalpel. "This is my home," Julian blustered, his arrogance rushing back to fill the void. "I'm not going anywhere. You are having an emotional breakdown. You need to rest. We will sort this out in the morning." Alara took a step toward him, forcing him to meet her gaze. "Before I started the Historical Preservation Fund, I spent 6 years as a prosecutor for the U.S. Attorney's Office, specializing in intellectual property theft. I know exactly how you used a shell corporation to acquire the source code for Nightingale from your biggest competitor. I have the wire transfer records. I have the whistleblower's deposition. I have a direct line to the top tech reporters at the Wall Street Journal who would love to see the proof. So when I tell you to get out, it is not a request. And you have until the fog burns off the top of that bridge to disappear before I dismantle your entire empire." Julian just stared at her, the blood draining from his face. For the first time in their marriage, he looked genuinely terrified. He grabbed his briefcase and was gone without another word. Alara watched him leave. Then her strength gave out, and she sank back into the chair, pulling out the tiny gray blanket and pressing it to her face. She gave herself 1 full minute for the grief. 1 minute to let a single, silent, body-racking sob consume her, to completely fall apart. Then she wiped her eyes, squared her shoulders, and picked up her phone. She scrolled to a contact she hadn't used in 5 years. A contact Julian had convinced her was an overbearing, controlling man who didn't respect their life together. A single name: Dad. Her thumb hovered over the call button, a lifetime of memories swirling. Julian's voice so smooth, so reasonable. "He just doesn't understand our world, Alara. He's a relic, Eleanor. A dinosaur from another era," Julian had said, swirling his wine. "Your brother lives in a world of spreadsheets and sensible shoes. He'll never understand what we're building. If you want this life with me, you have to choose." And she had chosen Julian. It was the most profound mistake she had ever made, but one she could now begin to undo. Her finger hovered over the contact, then pressed. The phone rang 3 times before a quiet, familiar voice answered, a voice she hadn't heard in 2 years, a voice that sounded surprised, yet somehow not. "Eleanor?" "David," her own voice cracked. "Julian's gone, and I'm completely alone." A beat of silence then, in a tone of cold, precise anger. "I'll be there in an hour." David Croft, a senior forensic accountant for one of the top firms in Manhattan, ended the call and got into a taxi. 90 minutes after her call, he arrived. He had come from his office in the financial district to her Upper East Side apartment without a moment's hesitation. Eleanor opened the door to a brother who seemed sharper than she remembered. 2 years had added a seriousness to his face and etched fine lines of concentration around his eyes. But the eyes were the same, analytical, methodical, the eyes of a man who spent his life finding the truth buried in columns of numbers. He took in his sister's hollowed-out expression and pulled her into a hug. Eleanor completely fell apart in his arms. It was the first time she'd allowed herself to cry since she left the doctor's office. A fragile numbness had gotten her through Julian's arrival, his empty apologies, the argument, and his final chilling words. But, held by her brother, Eleanor finally broke. "I shut you out," she sobbed, the words muffled against his shirt. "For 2 years, I listened when he said you were jealous, when he said I had to choose a side. I chose him, and now the baby is gone, and he's not even here." David just held her tighter. "I knew what he was. I knew what he was doing, and watching you drift away was the hardest audit I've ever had to endure." He eased her back, cupping her face in his hands, a gesture he hadn't used since they were kids. "Tell me everything," he said softly. "Start from the beginning." So she did. The affair she'd suspected for weeks, the spotting that had started that morning, the 20 unanswered calls to his cell, the charge on their credit card from a jewelry designer on Madison Avenue for a custom piece she had never seen. Julian's transparently false excuses, followed by his cruel, dismissive anger. When she finished, David was silent for a long moment, his jaw tight, his eyes taking on a cold, calculating glint. Eleanor recognized that look. It was the one he got when he found a critical flaw in a company's books. "What do you want to do?" he finally asked. Eleanor looked him straight in the eye. The grief was a physical weight inside her, but in the past few hours, it had been forged into something hard and sharp. "I want to ruin him," she said, her voice low and steady. "Everything. His gallery, his private collection, his reputation. I want him to understand what it feels like to have it all turned to dust." David gave a single, firm nod. "Then that's what we'll do. We will be surgical. We will be exact. And we will leave him with nothing. No rash decisions. No emotional plays. We map his entire financial network. We gather the documentation. We build the narrative. And when we're finished, Julian Croft will be nothing but a cautionary tale in the art world." David spoke with the calm certainty he used when briefing a board of directors about internal fraud. Methodical, pragmatic, and absolute. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Eleanor felt a tiny, fragile spark of something she thought was gone for good. Strength. "How?" she whispered. David opened his laptop, displaying not a hacker's interface, but a complex flowchart of interconnected holding companies, the battle map of a forensic accountant. "First, we need legal counsel. You were a curator at the Met before you quit to help him launch his gallery. Do you still have any contacts from your old life who could help us?" Eleanor considered it. One name immediately surfaced. "Maya Prasad," she said. "My roommate from Columbia. She's a partner at her own firm now. Specializes in white-collar crime. One of the best in New York." David's eyebrows went up. "Roommate? I don't think I've heard you mention her in at least 4 years." A wave of shame washed over her. "I pushed her away," Eleanor confessed. "Julian said she was too cynical, that her ambition was unattractive. He said she was a bad influence, so I just let the friendship fade." "And you believe she'll help you now?" Eleanor remembered Maya's fierce loyalty, her refusal to accept defeat, and the polite but persistent holiday texts she'd sent long after Eleanor had stopped responding. "Yes, I do." "Good. Contact her," David said, his focus already returning to the screen. "Next, leverage. You mentioned signing paperwork for art investment funds. Do you have copies?" "I have some of them. Scans of the initial agreements and a few transaction records I saved." But he kept the originals in his office safe. "I only learned about Isabel because my husband, Julian, left a receipt in his coat pocket. It was from a private jeweler on Madison Avenue, accidentally synced to our shared expense app. The item was a one-of-a-kind necklace, logged under anniversary gift I. That was the moment I knew I needed to understand his entire secret world, his private client list, his gallery's real finances, everything. My brother David gave me a calm, steady look I hadn't seen in years. "It's a good thing," he said, "that my entire profession is dedicated to untangling the finances people try to keep hidden." I hesitated. "Will this get ugly?" David's expression didn't change. "We can worry about the fallout after we've secured the facts." 3 days later, I was walking into the glass-walled offices of Prasad Law in a downtown skyscraper. The air between me and my old friend was thick with 4 years of silence and a friendship I had carelessly discarded. Maya Prasad looked every bit the top New York litigator. Her dress was understated but ferociously expensive, and she radiated an aura of unflappable confidence. But the second she saw me, 7 months pregnant and looking like I was about to shatter, her professional demeanor dissolved. Her eyes widened. Ellie, she breathed. Oh my God, I knew you were pregnant. I am so incredibly thrilled for you. She came around her desk and gave me a hug that washed away 4 years of guilt and neglect. We sat in her office, the city skyline behind us, speaking in low voices over bottled waters we didn't drink. I need your help, Maya, I finally said, and not just as a friend. I need the best white-collar crime attorney in the city. Everyone I asked said that was you. Maya nodded slowly, her gaze becoming sharp and focused. I can handle a divorce settlement, Ellie, but from the way you're looking at me, I'm guessing this is about something more. I slid a folder across her polished desk. Inside was the evidence I had, a copy of the jeweler's receipt, bank statements showing huge, unexplained transfers, and the paperwork David had asked me to find. Julian had me sign documents, I explained, my voice barely a whisper. He called them art investment funds, for our future, for the baby. I never questioned it. I trusted him completely. But now, I think they were something else. Maya opened the folder, and with every page she turned, the concerned friend receded, and the prosecutor she used to be came to the surface. These aren't investment funds, she said finally, her voice dangerously low. These are articles of incorporation for a dozen different LLCs registered in Delaware. Ellie, if this is all accurate, your husband has been using your name to establish a network of shell companies. What does that even mean? I asked, a feeling of icy dread creeping up my spine. It means you need to find out what those companies were used for. Because if he was using them for something illegal, like laundering money for a client or hiding assets from the IRS, your signature makes you the sole managing member. Legally, that makes you his co-conspirator. The color drained from my face. So he wasn't just having an affair, he was setting me up to take the fall. That's exactly what it looks like. Maya's hand rested on mine over the cool surface of the desk. But this is also how we dismantle him. If we can prove he fraudulently induced you to sign, that you had no knowledge of his criminal intent, we can turn this whole thing around. He stops being the savvy art dealer and becomes the man who orchestrated a complex fraud using his pregnant wife as the primary vehicle. How can we prove that? I asked. We begin by creating a complete forensic map of his business empire. Every LLC you signed for, every piece of art he bought or sold through them. We follow the money, and we bring in a forensic accountant who is an absolute killer. I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling a cold rush of purpose. I can do that. My brother is already digging into the gallery's servers. Your brother? Maya looked stunned. I thought you and David weren't speaking. My jaw clenched. We weren't, but discovering that your brother-in-law is a lying cheat who is framing his pregnant wife as a potential felon has a way of healing old wounds. Maya was silent for a moment. Then she gave my hand a squeeze. I told you back at Columbia that there was something about Julian that felt hollow, she said gently. You told me I was just being a cynic. I know, I whispered, the words choked with regret. Maya, I am so sorry. Don't be sorry, she said, her voice turning to steel. Be ready, because I am going to help you burn it all to the ground. Maya's expression was cold, analytical. We're going to dismantle this, brick by brick. Whatever comes next, I'm right here with you. It was the first moment since I discovered that secret burner phone that I felt something other than a hollow, crushing emptiness. I felt the strength of a friendship I was certain I'd neglected into oblivion, the unyielding power of a bond that had been stretched thin but refused to snap. Thank you, I whispered, my voice choked with tears I wouldn't let fall. Maya gave a humorless smile. Save the thanks. Thank me when we get a court order that locks down every asset in that bastard's biotech empire. The digital forensic work took 2 weeks. 2 weeks of my existence spent deciphering encrypted messages, of hushed, secure video conferences with Maya's network of cybersecurity analysts and financial investigators. I became someone else in those 14 days. The crying ceased. I began to eat again, to force myself into disciplined 2-hour sleep cycles, to operate. The woman I was before was gone. Some fundamental part of me burned away. The ache was still a permanent fixture in my chest, but it had hardened into something I could use, a kind of armor. With the detached precision of an architect, I deconstructed the last 4 years of my life, cataloging every time Julian had casually passed me a tablet saying, "Just need your e-signature on this grant application, love. It's for the new research wing." Every late-night approval I had been too trusting, too exhausted to ever question. I remembered him creating new corporate entities he called our legacy fund. I recalled being half asleep, putting my absolute faith in my husband as I tapped approve on the screen without a second glance. He had taken my trust and forged it into a weapon to use against me. Meanwhile, my father began making calls. His old contacts from his days at the Securities and Exchange Commission were now senior partners at firms that specialized in tracking illicit capital flows. In just 10 days, they had lawfully assembled a 5-year timeline of Julian's corporate finances. The picture it painted made me physically ill. A complex web of shell companies, all established using my name and personal information, were being used to funnel kickbacks to corrupt officials at the FDA in return for fast-tracking approvals on his new drugs. The payment ledgers showed 6-figure sums moving to anonymous holding companies just days before a key regulatory hurdle for one of his blockbuster medications was cleared. "He's been paying off regulators for years," my father said, his voice grim over the encrypted line. "The question is, who else is in on it? Is he the only one at his company? Or is this a conspiracy that goes all the way to the top of the agency?" I stared at the flowcharts, my former life as a historical preservation architect feeling like it belonged to a different person. "Some of these transfers are odd," I pointed out, my eye for patterns catching an anomaly. "Look, this one went to a Cayman Islands account a week before a decision on a competitor's drug was delayed. His company had no direct involvement in that, which suggests he has allies who are also enemies of his rivals," my father concluded. That was a problem for later. Right now, we had more than enough. 2 weeks after I first found that hidden phone, I was in Simone's glass-walled Boston office, staring at a mountain of digital evidence, proof of bribery, decrypted texts outlining his affair with Amelia, his research assistant, and the most damning piece of all, GPS and cell tower data that Maya's team had extracted from his burner phone. The phone's location data pinpointed Julian's exact movements on the night I'd had a pregnancy scare 2 months earlier. I had been calling him frantically as my sister drove me to the emergency room. On the monitor, Simone replayed the timeline. It showed him at a 5-star hotel across town. It showed my name flashing on his screen, call after unanswered call, and it showed him silencing each one. He then sent a text to Amelia. "Minor data issue with the clinical trial. Handling it now." "He knew," I said, my voice eerily calm. "He knew I was terrified and on my way to the hospital, and he chose to ignore me for her." Simone nodded, her face hardening with controlled fury. "This, on top of the financial fraud, is everything we need to ruin him. Are you ready for me to file?" I looked at the data on the screen, all the pain and betrayal compressed into spreadsheets and legal documents. I thought about the baby growing inside of me, about the future I now had to build from the ground up. I thought of every lie he ever told about a late night at the lab. "File it," I said, my voice like steel. Simone reached for her desk phone, but as her finger paused over the dial pad, my own phone vibrated. A text from an unknown number. I read it, and a chill spread through my entire body. You should have stayed out of the FDA business. The message was blunt. Walk away now. You don't know who you're dealing with. I held the phone out for Simone, my lawyer, who read it with a deep frown. That doesn't feel like Julian, I said, a slight tremor in my voice. He uses lawyers and veiled corporate threats, not this kind of street-level intimidation. This is from someone else, someone connected to the payoffs. Have you spoken to anyone at his firm about this? Simone asked. Not a soul. This has to be tied to whoever sent me the initial tip about the burner phone. Simone placed her phone back on its cradle. Do you want to hold off? Maybe we need to reassess our approach. I considered it for less than a second before my resolve hardened. No chance. We're filing at 9 a.m. tomorrow, I declared. Running and hiding won't protect me from him, or from whoever sent this message. We move fast, and we find out who's really at the center of this web. Simone's professional mask broke, revealing a sharp, approving smile. There's the Chloe I know, she said. It's good to see you again. We filed the divorce petition that Thursday. By Friday evening, my life had imploded for the second time. It started with a firm, official knock on the door of my townhouse. Two people, a man and a woman, in plain, dark suits, stood in my doorway, flashing FBI badges. Mrs. Thorne, I'm Agent Miller. And I'm Agent Davis. We need to ask you some questions about a series of biomedical holding companies. My blood ran cold. I knew the names they reeled off. They were the shell corporations from my father's investigation. What about them? I managed to ask, my voice barely audible. You're listed as the primary officer and signatory on all of their corporate filings, Agent Miller stated, his tone flat and impersonal. We've traced a pattern of highly suspicious payments moving through these accounts, all correlating with key FDA approval dates. I have no knowledge of any of that, I said. My husband said they were for holding intellectual property, just standard corporate structuring. We hear that a lot, Mrs. Thorne. Agent Davis spoke up then, his voice edged with skepticism. May we come in? I wanted to slam the door, to scream for Simone, for my father, for anyone, but I knew what denying entry to federal agents would look like. Yes, of course, I said, stepping aside. Please, come in. They interrogated me for what felt like an eternity, though the clock on the wall insisted it was only 4 hours. By the time they left, I felt hollowed out. They had it all. Digital authorizations, with my signature on them, transferring millions of dollars to offshore accounts right before favorable regulatory decisions were made on Julian's products. They had constructed a perfect, airtight case of conspiracy and fraud, and I was the one they were going to put in the cage. The moment the door closed behind them, I collapsed onto my couch, staring at nothing. Julian hadn't just betrayed our marriage. He hadn't just left me alone while I feared for our baby's life. He had spent years deliberately and meticulously building a criminal empire designed to have me take the fall. My phone lit up. The same unknown number. I warned you. A second text came through a moment later. It was a link to a flight tracking website. My hand shook as I opened it. It showed a private jet that had taken off from Boston an hour earlier. Its destination was Monaco, a principality with no extradition treaty with the United States. And the passenger list contained only two names, Julian and Amelia. A courier delivered a legal notice to Chloe's new, far more modest apartment. Julian Thorne was suing for full custody of their unborn baby, claiming she was emotionally unstable, was attempting to sabotage his life-saving biotech company, and was a danger to their child. The petition was filled with sworn affidavits from people she once considered friends, executives from Julian's company. People she had hosted in her home for dinner were now on record stating she was prone to vindictive fantasies and paranoia. Her phone rang. It was Simone, her lawyer. "Chloe, we've got a massive problem." "I know, I'm reading it now. Julian is trying to take my baby." "It's much worse than that," Simone said, her voice tight with alarm. "Julian filed for divorce from Monaco this morning. He's controlling the narrative, and the claims he's making are pure poison." "What claims?" "He's alleging that your pregnancy has induced a severe psychological breakdown, that you threatened to ruin his company with false accusations, and that he is the victim, trying to protect his legacy. He has his entire C-suite ready to perjure themselves for him." "That's certifiably insane. I put my own architectural career on hold for 3 years to support his dream. I was at every late-night session, every zoning board meeting for the new lab. Julian was the one who was never there." "I know that, Chloe, and we will prove it. But his story is already hitting the business news wires in Boston. Liam's mother, a senator who holds court in the State House, is on the phone with every major donor in Boston. The party machine is closing ranks around him. Not you." Evelyn rubbed her temples, trying to ward off a wave of nausea. "So, I'm the hysterical one." "Exactly. The emotionally volatile pregnant doctor who couldn't handle the pressure of a campaign. The bitter wife looking for a payday. The one who supposedly orchestrated the back-channel donations he's being investigated for. He's systematically assassinating your character before you can say a single word in your defense. How can I possibly fight that narrative?" "We fight it with the truth. The encrypted emails from his campaign manager, the burner phone logs, the offshore account statements. We construct our own narrative. And we give it to a national reporter before he can spin this any further," her brother David added, his voice sharp. "But here's the dangerous part. If the Federal Election Commission thinks for 1 second you were a willing participant in this, you're looking at serious prison time. Our number one priority is to prove he coerced you, that you had no clue you were being used to funnel illegal contributions from that pharma lobby." "How long will that take?" "There's no way to know. Weeks, maybe months." Evelyn stared at a crack in the plaster of her small new apartment. Less than a month ago, she was preparing a nursery in a Beacon Hill brownstone, married to a charismatic congressman, living a life she thought was a fairy tale. Now she was staring down the barrel of a vicious divorce, being painted as the villain in a political scandal, and facing a smear campaign engineered to destroy her career. "My brother," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Did you hear from him?" "He called me about an hour ago. He's on the move. He told me to tell you to stand your ground." "What's he planning?" "He didn't say, and I knew better than to ask. But Evelyn, I've worked with David Reed for over a decade. The man doesn't make threats. He dismantles corporations. Whatever he's putting together, someone is about to have a very, very bad day." "God, I hope so," Evelyn breathed. "I really, truly hope so." The next 14 days were the loneliest Evelyn had ever known. The official divorce papers were served, along with a court order freezing all their joint accounts, leaving her financially stranded. She was deposed by Liam's legal team in a conference room where every question dripped with accusation. Everywhere she went, she felt the cold shoulder of social banishment. Old colleagues from the city's medical elite would suddenly become engrossed in their phones if she entered a cafe. At a hospital charity gala, the wife of a prominent surgeon cornered her by the silent auction tables. "I've heard what you're trying to do to Liam," she said, her voice loud enough for others to hear. "He is a dedicated public servant trying to fix this city's healthcare system, and you're trying to ruin him over some personal drama. You should be ashamed of yourself." Evelyn said nothing. She placed her sparkling water on a passing waiter's tray, left her untouched shrimp cocktail, and walked out of the ballroom with her head held high, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. But later, in the quiet of her new apartment, with the curtains drawn against the Boston skyline, her composure crumbled. She collapsed onto the floor of the empty room, meant to be a nursery, clutching a black and white sonogram photo, and cried until there was nothing left. When she was done, she just sat there, staring into the darkness. She wondered if this was how it ended, not with a righteous legal battle, but with a quiet, suffocating defeat. Her phone buzzed. A text from her brother. "I'm on my way up. We have to change our approach." 30 minutes later, David Reed walked into the apartment and found his sister looking completely shattered. He didn't offer empty reassurances or promise it would all work out. He simply pulled up a chair to face her, his eyes as intense and focused as they were in a courtroom. "You're making the classic mistake of every client I've ever had who's been backed into a corner," he said, his voice even and precise. "You're mistaking the loss of your current battlefield for the loss of the entire war." Evelyn just shook her head. "He has everything, David. The money, the best law firms in New England. He's controlling the entire story. The media thinks I'm some vindictive shrew. I have nothing left." "Nothing." Her brother leaned forward. "You have me. You have the objective truth. And you have leverage that Liam Sterling is too arrogant to even imagine. I did not spend 20 years navigating the most hostile corporate takeovers in New York to watch some silver spoon politician with a hero complex destroy my sister. We are not playing his game anymore, Evelyn. We are going to play ours. And our game is asymmetrical." "How?" A small, cold smile touched her brother's lips. "We take away his foundation. We make sure every person propping him up understands the personal cost of their loyalty. By the time we're done, Liam Sterling won't have a single ally left in Massachusetts. And that's when he'll finally understand what it means to have nothing." The private library of an old Boston social club was all dark mahogany, worn leather, and the hushed silence of old money. David Reed sat at one end of a large table with a glass of iced tea. Seated across from him were two men, the primary financial backer of Liam's campaign and the influential editor of the city's most powerful newspaper. "Gentlemen," David started, his tone relaxed and conversational. "Thank you for meeting me. I know you're both heavily invested in Liam's political future." The donor, a real estate tycoon named Marcus Thorne, nodded slowly. "Your reputation precedes you, Mr. Reed. When you request a meeting, people tend to show up. What can we do for you, Mr. Reed?" "It's more about what I can do for you." David slid a thick bound legal document across the antique table. "It has come to my attention that there are some significant legal exposures within the Sterling campaign. Specifically, a pattern of illegal straw donations and wire fraud, all orchestrated by your candidate, Liam Sterling." The two men traded a quick, guarded glance. David saw the immediate tension behind their stoic expressions. "What sort of exposures?" The editor, a man named Harris, asked, his voice now clipped. David tapped a finger on the document's cover. "Illegal funds funneled through Shell LLCs to secretly purchase land along a proposed waterfront development zone. A clear-cut case of insider trading, using his political influence for personal enrichment. All of it facilitated by his campaign manager, Isabel Vance, and funded by donations from men like you." A heavy silence settled over the room. "Now," David continued, "I'm not for a moment suggesting either of you knew about this. I'm sure you're just as shocked as I am to learn that the man you've backed has been using your good names and your capital to commit federal crimes. If this is true, Harris said, his voice now like ice, why bring it to us? Why not take it straight to the U.S. Attorney's Office? Because I believe in giving professionals a chance to manage their own liabilities before a situation becomes radioactive. And because federal prosecutors, once they find a crime like this, tend to pull on every thread, they won't stop with Sterling. They'll start asking why a major newspaper's editorial board offered such a glowing endorsement without basic vetting, and why a respected developer was making such large, untraceable donations. The implied threat was surgical and perfectly clear. Marcus Thorne's jaw was clenched so tightly, it was a wonder it didn't break. "What do you want, Reed?" Harris asked, all pretense of civility gone. David met his gaze directly. "My terms are simple. I want Liam Sterling to withdraw from the race. For personal reasons. Effective immediately. I want his campaign manager, Isabel Vance, gone. And I want an ironclad guarantee that my sister's name is completely cleared and never mentioned in connection to any of this. And if we refuse, then this entire file, along with a mountain of supporting evidence, goes to the national desk of the New York Times, whose reporters would love nothing more than to expose a corrupt Boston political machine. But I imagine that the two men who have the most to lose from that kind of public explosion are sitting right here." Harris held his stare for a long, tense moment. Then he reached for the document and opened it. David sat back, waiting as he watched the color drain from their faces as they flipped through the bank statements and incriminating emails. Finally, Harris looked up at Thorne. A silent, grim understanding passed between them. "We will need to confirm this," Thorne said, his voice a low rumble. "Of course," David said, getting to his feet. "I would expect nothing less, but I advise you to confirm it quickly. This sort of intelligence has a way of becoming unstable if not handled correctly." He moved to the door, then paused. "And one final point, gentlemen. My daughter is expecting my first grandchild. Mr. Thorne was using their shared assets to underwrite his affair with Miss Rossi, his cohort in this deception. So when I state that I want him removed, I trust you realize I am exercising a truly remarkable degree of professional composure." He left. 2 days later, Marcus Thorne walked into the sleek marble lobby of Thorne Development, only to be stopped by two stoic men from corporate security. "Mr. Thorne," the head of security said, his voice devoid of any warmth, "we will need you to come with us." "What is this about? The board has some questions concerning the Echelon Tower account." Marcus's typical swagger faltered for a second as he was escorted toward the private executive elevator. He noticed the sudden silence that fell over the junior developers, the way his own personal assistant suddenly found her shoes incredibly fascinating, the intense, laser-like focus everyone now had on their computer screens. Inside the expansive glass conference room, both senior partners were waiting, their expressions like stone. "Marcus," Arthur said, his voice completely stripped of its usual warmth. "Take a seat. What the hell is going on? You are being placed on indefinite administrative leave, pending a forensic investigation into a pattern of severe financial misrepresentations to this company." Marcus's face went pale. "That is preposterous. Whatever you believe you've discovered, there is a straightforward and logical reason for it." "I am certain there is," Arthur retorted. "But until our independent accountants find it, you are cut off from the company. Your network credentials, your key card, and all your corporate charge accounts have been revoked. Security will escort you from the building after you have collected your personal belongings. You can't do this." "We are." The company's lawyer pushed a tablet across the polished table, showing the formal letter of his suspension. "If you plan to contest this action, I suggest you confer with your attorneys. but I would highly advise against creating a scene. Financial journalists tend to take notice when our top executives are escorted out by security. Marcus's eyes darted from the tablet's bright screen to the grim-faced partners, then to the two imposing guards flanking the doorway. For the first time, a surge of pure panic crashed over him. "This is far from over," he seethed, grabbing the device. "You have no idea whose enemy you just made." Perhaps the other partner, Henry, replied, his tone icy, "but we are merely correcting a lapse in our own judgment." "Enjoy your afternoon, Mr. Thorne." Eleanor learned about Marcus's forced suspension from a calm, measured call from her father. "It's a takeover. They're trying to steal the company," he had shouted into her voicemail. She deleted it without listening to the rest and called her father. "How did you know for sure he would react that way?" "I merely shone a spotlight on a very corrupt transaction, Eleanor. They made their own choice on how to handle the rot. What is our next move?" "Now, we wait. Marcus will grow desperate. He will reach out to his confidants, his partner in this mess, anyone he thinks can bail him out, and we will be listening to it all. That is what will reveal the true extent of this conspiracy. And my financial exposure? Your legal team is erecting a firewall, but Eleanor, the investigator, Daniel, has delivered his initial findings. The network of shell companies they used for the art purchases was the thread that unraveled their whole operation. Excellent work. But can he claim he wasn't involved? We can prove he was. We have the signed wire authorizations and digital records placing him at the center of every critical transaction. What we lack for now is proof of who was guiding him. My people are working on it." Eleanor took a long, deep breath. It was the first time in months she felt she could actually get enough air into her lungs. "Thank you, Dad. Don't thank me yet. We are just at the beginning." The next crucial piece of the puzzle came from a source she had never anticipated. Daniel called Eleanor 3 days after Marcus was forced out, his voice sharp with an urgency she had never heard from him before. "I've been doing a deep dive into Isabel Rossi's history," he started, "and I have something explosive." "What is it?" "She is not just Marcus's mistress. She is the architect of this entire fraud." "What are you talking about?" "I'm saying she selected Marcus with the care of a hunter tracking big game. Years ago. She built a complete profile on him long before he laid eyes on her. She knew about his role at Thorne Development. She knew about your family and the Vance Hotel dynasty. Why? Because this is not her first time orchestrating corporate sabotage. Just a different name, a different city, a different mark. I have traced her signature to at least 3 other similar incidents. Eleanor, Isabel Rossi is an entirely fabricated identity. We have absolutely no idea what her real name is. She has a sealed SEC file from when she was a minor for a massive insider trading scheme in London more than a decade ago. She erased her past and built a new life from scratch. Eleanor felt the terrible, cold logic of it all click into place. So Marcus was never the one pulling the strings. Marcus was the asset, a pawn she could maneuver at will. Isabel has been playing a high-stakes game of chess, and he thought he was the most powerful piece on the board. But why our family? We aren't in real estate. Marcus's income is considerable, but it's not generational wealth. Your father, Daniel's voice turned grave. She targeted Marcus to get to you, and she targeted you to get to Richard Vance. Your father's reputation was forged in the fire of hostile takeovers of his rivals. Someone holding a long-standing grudge with very deep pockets would view hiring a ghost like her as the most poetic form of revenge. Eleanor leaned back into the sofa. She had believed Marcus was the villain. She had been completely mistaken. Marcus was simply the weapon. The real adversary was a phantom she had never even met. Does my father know about this? He is being briefed as we speak. And Eleanor, he is absolutely furious. I can only imagine. There is more. That offshore investment account they established in both their names? A huge portion of the money has been moved to a second, untraceable cryptocurrency wallet. A wallet that has the same digital signature as one of Isabel's previous schemes. She has been draining their own fraud from the inside. Marcus likely has no idea. So her final move was to bankrupt the company, ruin my family's reputation, and then vanish with all the money, leaving Marcus to take the fall? That appears to be the strategy, yes. Eleanor closed her eyes. The sheer scale of the deception was stunning. She had nearly lost her baby, her husband, her family's name, and her own sanity, all because of a specter she never knew existed. What do we do now? Now, Daniel said, we give them just enough rope to hang each other, and then we light a match. The tactic was savagely effective. Isabel had controlled Marcus for years, feeding his ambition and his ego while he was convinced he was the one making the decisions. All Eleanor and her team had to do was show him who was really pulling the strings. His own narcissism and instinct for self-preservation would handle the rest. It started with a meticulously forged set of auction records, a digital bait designed to appear as a secret leak from within Isabel's network of shell corporations. It was planted on a private server that Marcus, in his desperate hunt for something to save his own skin, was guaranteed to hack. Every document in the file told the exact same story. Isabel was not his accomplice, she was the director of the whole affair, and she was seconds away from severing ties and disappearing with their entire stolen fortune. Marcus, being Marcus, reacted with nothing but pure, wounded fury. The confrontation occurred in her sterile, white-walled gallery overlooking the Chicago River. Marcus barged in, holding a tablet that displayed fake art provenance documents, his face twisted into a mask of pure rage. "You've been selling me forgeries," he accused. "This whole time, you've been inventing fake collections and billing my company for art that never existed. You were setting me up to be the sole target of a wire fraud investigation." Isabel remained completely calm. She had planned for this very encounter. "Planned for what, Marcus, my love? Your paranoia is running away with you. Whatever forged papers you think you have, I am certain there is a simple explanation." "Explain this," he demanded, shoving the tablet toward her. It showed falsified auction logs, forged certificates of authenticity, and a clear financial trail that led directly to a crypto account he had never heard of. Isabel barely glanced at the screen, her composure unshaken, but a tiny twitch in her eye betrayed her. She was recalculating, adjusting to the new threat. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "Does it matter? You have been playing me from the very beginning. Everything I sacrificed, every risk I took, it was all so you could cash out and leave me to face the feds. Was any of it real? Or was I just the man with the financial access you needed?" Isabel placed the tablet on a marble pedestal and turned to him, her expression melting into one of feigned sadness. "Oh, Marcus, you really are unable to see the grand design, aren't you? Everything I did was to secure our future. The plan was always to build our fund and then disappear, to a place where we would be untouchable together." Together. Marcus let out a harsh, ugly laugh. "You were carefully creating a paper trail that implicated my pregnant wife's family. You were going to let me go to prison so you could walk away clean. I was creating a firewall against your father-in-law, Marcus, not building a cage for you. There's a world of difference. Your wife's foundation was the source of the initial seed money. Her digital authorizations are all over the transfers. Catherine is the one the SEC will put under a microscope. When this implodes, she's the one who takes the fall, and we collect. And the Zurich account? A little insurance in case you developed a conscience. Genevieve glided closer, her voice a low, intimate purr. But it doesn't have to be that way. We can still have it all. The life we designed together. Marcus just looked at her, his expression a chaotic storm of betrayal and desire. Catherine's private investigator, listening through the bug in the penthouse, barely dared to breathe, waiting to see if Marcus's greed would overwhelm his instinct to survive. It did not. "I believed in you," he said, his voice utterly empty. "I detonated my entire life for you. I was going to burn everything to the ground for you. And the whole time, your endgame was to fleece me and leave me to the wolves. Marcus, listen to me." "No." He took a step back toward the elevator. "I'm done. From this moment on, you are completely on your own." He was gone. Genevieve stared at the empty space where he had stood, her mask of cool composure finally cracking to reveal the glacial fury that lay beneath. Marcus went straight to the board of Thorne Industries. He laid out the entire scheme. The plot to short the stock, the manipulated market data, the hidden Swiss bank account, and he told them everything about Genevieve Dubois and her well-documented history of destroying corporations from the inside out. He presented himself as the ultimate patsy, a man brought to ruin by a brilliant and predatory mastermind. The board listened in stunned silence, recorded every word of his testimony, and then immediately alerted the federal authorities. 2 days later, federal agents approached Genevieve Dubois at the Chicago Global Finance Summit, just as she was descending the stage after giving the opening keynote. They didn't find a woman packed to flee. They found her basking in a standing ovation. They arrested her right there in the grand ballroom, in front of 1,000 of her peers and the lions of the financial world. The glare from a dozen smartphone flashes caught her by surprise, the light reflecting off the towering windows of her office. Within moments, the pictures were viral. Genevieve Dubois, the infamous corporate raider, her face a portrait of cold rage as a federal marshal served her with a sealed indictment. The news detonated across financial networks. Wall Street was in an uproar. From the quiet of her Lincoln Park brownstone, Catherine watched it all happen, her best friend Sarah, a top reporter for the Journal, sitting beside her. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, a sense of profound relief washed over her. "It's over," she whispered. "It has to be, right? Your article is everywhere. Marcus gave the feds everything they need. They'll bury her." Sarah nodded, her gaze locked on the television. "It seems that way. They've completely bought the narrative that your charity was her primary vehicle for the fraud. Our data trail confirms it. The encrypted emails, the wire transfers laundered through a dozen shell companies. So, I'm in the clear?" "You're in the clear." Catherine let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for a year, the crushing weight on her soul finally starting to lift. Her gaze drifted to a framed sonogram picture on the bookshelf, a tiny, perfect image. "I kept you safe, my love," she murmured. "It's all finished now." But it was not finished. 2 days later, Catherine's phone rang. Sarah's voice was strained, laced with disbelief. "The SEC just dropped all charges against Genevieve." "What?" "Their star witness, the lead traitor from Marcus's team, he withdrew his entire statement. He now claims he fabricated all the evidence you leaked to the press. Every last document. He's saying he was threatened. The digital evidence has been suppressed by a federal judge, pending a review of its authenticity. A judge she owns ruled it was obtained illegally." "That's impossible. How could she do that?" "I don't know, but Genevieve is free. And Catherine, it gets worse. What could possibly be worse? She knows it was you. She knows you were the one who put the pieces together and gave me the story. And Geneviève Dubois is not the type of woman to let a thing like that slide. Catherine sank onto the couch, the fragile sense of peace she had found shattering into a million tiny shards. She's coming after me. She's coming after both of us. Whatever influence she has, whatever favors she can call in, she's going to use them to burn us both to the ground. What do? We keep fighting, Catherine. There's nothing else we can do. The counterattack came just hours later. Catherine was at a prenatal appointment, trying to concentrate on the strong, steady rhythm of her baby's heartbeat on the monitor, when her phone buzzed with a news alert. A star financial reporter for the Wall Street Journal, Sarah Jenkins, had been suspended indefinitely for gross journalistic misconduct and fabricating sources. The story cited an anonymous senior editor at her own paper. Catherine felt the blood drain from her face. She's silencing our only voice, she realized, her hands beginning to shake. The doctor looked at her with concern. Mrs. Thorne, are you all right? Your blood pressure just spiked dramatically. Don't give up, Marcus had pleaded with her. You have to see this to the end. But how could she possibly do that now? The doctor's lecture about the dangers of extreme stress during pregnancy was echoing in her mind. Her closest friend and the key to her public defense was now fighting for her career, completely neutralized. Catherine felt trapped. The calm, sterile walls of the examination room suddenly feeling like they were closing in. She was completely on her own, except she wasn't. Not quite. Her phone buzzed one more time. An incoming call from their family's attorney, Mr. Davies. Catherine braced herself for another devastating blow, and it landed right on schedule. I have to formally step down as counsel for your foundation, Catherine. His voice was flat, stripped of its usual authority. What? No, Mr. Davies. You've handled my family's legal affairs for 30 years. Geneviève has me backed into a corner. A merger I handled a decade ago had some loose ends, things I was assured would never see the light of day. If I don't withdraw, she's threatened to leak the entire unredacted file to the Attorney General. She will destroy my firm, my reputation, everything I've ever built. Please, you gave us your word you would see us through this. There was a long, painful silence on the line before the old lawyer's voice came back, thick with shame. I am truly sorry, Catherine. I wish I had the courage to fight her, but I don't. I have grandchildren, a legacy. I can't sacrifice it all for this battle. I understand, Catherine replied, even as a cold fury began to build inside her, a feeling of absolute and total abandonment. Thank you for everything you've done. I hope she gets everything she deserves. Catherine, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I honestly do. The line went dead. Catherine sat on the edge of the examination table, the low hum of the medical equipment the only sound in the room. Her friend was disgraced, her lawyer had deserted her, and her adversary was free, more powerful than ever, and now aimed directly at her. She had never felt so profoundly and terrifyingly alone. The room, with its soothing art and quiet efficiency, suddenly felt like a tomb. The wellness posters on the wall about tranquility and inner peace seemed like a sick joke. Her entire strategy was in ashes. Geneviève was untouchable. Marcus was now the singular focus of the SEC's investigation, his claims of being manipulated now seen as a desperate ploy to evade accountability for his own crimes. The mountain of evidence they had gathered was now either sealed by the court or deemed inadmissible. Every road forward was a dead end, and Geneviève was only just beginning her revenge. The packages started arriving that afternoon, delivered by a series of unmarked couriers. Each was an exquisitely designed act of psychological warfare. A wreath of black, dead roses. A hand-carved rocking horse, shattered into splinters. A meticulously detailed prospectus for the hostile takeover and liquidation of Catherine's family foundation. Did you honestly believe you could challenge me? A small, elegant card read, "Your husband is a disgrace. Your allies have abandoned you. Who is left to save you? I will burn down every single thing you hold dear. And I will give you a front row seat to the bonfire." Catherine ordered her security team to incinerate every package without opening them, refusing to grant Genevieve the satisfaction of knowing they had an impact. She understood that any display of fear would be a point scored for her enemy, proof that the campaign of terror was working. Catherine would not give her that. But that evening, sitting alone in the dark, silent nursery, she felt the first deep fractures in her resolve. What was the point? She had gambled everything, fought with every ounce of her strength, and it had all amounted to nothing. Marcus was facing ruin. Their family's legacy was in tatters, and Genevieve was toasting her own victory. Each time she found the strength to get up, she was knocked back down with even greater brutality. Perhaps it was time to surrender. Perhaps it was time to run. She picked up the small, sterling silver frame holding the sonogram image, her thumb gently tracing the perfect outline of her baby's head. The powerful, steady heartbeat she had listened to that morning at the doctor's office felt like a lifetime ago. "I couldn't keep you safe," she whispered, her voice finally breaking. "I tried so desperately, but I failed." The grief she had held back for so long finally broke free, a silent, crushing wave of despair. She sank into the rocking chair, her entire body shaking with deep, gut-wrenching sobs, letting out all the fear and hopelessness she had suppressed for months. When the emotional storm finally subsided, a firm hand came to rest on her shoulder. It was Marcus. He looked haggard, 10 years older, but there was a new fire in his eyes. He knelt in front of her chair. "Your father called," he said quietly. "He's liquidating his overseas assets to establish a new private war chest. He told me to tell you, the thorns don't run from a fight. We reload. And more fragile." But as Isabella entered the private wing of the Miami hospital, his gaze was as sharp as it had always been. "You look like you just wrestled a shark and lost," he said, his voice raspy. Isabella managed a faint smile. "That's putting it mildly." "Fair enough," he acknowledged, gesturing with a thin hand to the chair beside his bed. "Sit. Tell me what's been happening while I've been stuck in here negotiating with nurses." Isabella sat, and the entire disaster came flooding out, discovering Marcus's affair, his collusion with Victoria, the gallery's assets being frozen, the brutal articles planted in the press, and the crushing weight of the betrayal. Arthur listened without moving, his expression unreadable. When she trailed off, the only sound was the steady ping of the cardiac monitor. "So, that's your move?" he asked. "You're just going to let that woman burn it all to the ground? I don't see what else I can do." "Yes, you do." Isabella looked at him, her eyes clouded with a fresh wave of tears. "You are a Rossi," Arthur said, his voice regaining its old authority. "You are not a victim. You don't get to be helpless. And you are damn well not going to let some vulture capitalist demolish what this family built from nothing. She's already won, Dad. She's taken everything. She has merely destroyed your first line of defense, that is all," he countered, shifting in the bed with a wince. "Back when I was building my first hotel, we had a name for this kind of assault. A decapitation strike. Your primary partner has been compromised, your capital has been seized, and your reputation is being systematically dismantled. It feels like the end of the world, I get it. It's not. It is the start of the real fight. Our first plan was all defense," he continued. "We were trying to manage the damage with public relations statements and legal warnings. That was a mistake. So now, we changed the arena. What other arena is there?" Arthur's smile was thin and dangerous, a shadow of the fierce dealmaker he once was. "Victoria has a history," he said. "She has executed this exact strategy before on other developers, other families. You need to find them. Predators like her always leave a trail of bodies, and the ghosts remember everything. Find the people she's broken. Uncover what they know. Dig up the proof she thinks is buried for good. But how? I have no idea where to even start. You begin with the wreckage, he instructed. Go through old real estate journals, bankruptcy filings from the last decade, forms for failed luxury brands. Look for her playbook. Victoria has been running this con for at least 15 years. She has left her tracks all over the world. You just need to learn how to spot them. And if I find these other people, what then? You do the one thing she would never see coming, Arthur said, his eyes glinting. You organize them. You give them a voice. You offer them a chance to take back their names. You don't just fight her. You build a coalition. Isabella leaned back, her mind suddenly racing. A coalition. Victoria's entire strategy was based on isolating her targets, on hunting the business owners who were overextended and alone, with no allies to call on. She took them out one by one in silence, because she is convinced they are too broken to ever fight back alone. But if they stand together, Arthur finished, you might finally have the power to bring her entire empire down. Isabella let the idea take root in her mind. It was a massive gamble. It was dangerous. She had no idea if she could find anyone, much less persuade them to join her. Still, it was a strategy, a new path, a reason to keep fighting. I'll try, she whispered. No, Arthur corrected, his head giving a slight shake. You will win, because surrender is not in our blood, not for you, and not for that baby. Isabella nodded slowly, then leaned forward and kissed her father's temple. You need to get some sleep, she said. I have some digging to do. For the next 72 hours, Isabella was glued to her laptop. She dove into the digital archives of architectural digests and international property listings. She searched for common patterns in sudden project collapses, intellectual property lawsuits, and hostile buyouts that ended in financial ruin. She was hunting for entrepreneurs whose stories sounded exactly like what Victoria was trying to do to her own family. And slowly, piece by piece, she began to find them. A boutique hotel chain in Milan that went bankrupt in 2019. The founder was framed for sourcing illegal materials, based on a tip from an anonymous competitor. He lost everything. A high-end design firm in London back in 2021. The partners were driven into a legal battle by accusations of fraud, which allowed Victoria to acquire their portfolio for pennies on the dollar. A sustainable resort project in the Caribbean in 2023. It was the same script, the same devastating conclusion, and buried in the code of old, encrypted websites and private investor chats, Isabella found traces of the same quiet buyer. Operating through a series of shell corporations, Apex Global, Orion Ventures, Crestwood Holdings, 4 different corporate names, 4 ruined companies, 1 predator. Isabella collected all the data into a single, highly secured file. Names, dates, locations, and fragments of proof. Then she started to connect the dots. One name kept appearing in multiple case files, not as a victim, but as a forensic accountant who had tried to sound the alarm. A man named Leo Vance. Isabella tracked him to a small private investigation firm in a sleepy part of Fort Lauderdale. She dialed the number on his website. It rang 3 times before a man answered. Who is this? Leo's voice was clipped and suspicious. My name is Isabella Rossi. I believe we have a mutual acquaintance, a woman who now runs Vanguard Equity. I think you dealt with her when she was operating under a different name? A heavy silence stretched across the line before a low, bitter voice replied, Meridian Capital. That was the name she used when she destroyed my career. I know, Isabella said, her hand clenching the phone until her knuckles were white. "She's trying to do the same thing to my family's art gallery right now, and I was hoping you might be willing to help me stop her." There was another long pause. "I saved everything," Leo said, at last. "Every doctored invoice, every offshore transfer, every falsified prospectus. I always knew a day like this would come. I knew someone else would eventually come looking for the truth." "I'm on my way now," Isabella said. "Just tell me where to go." Leo gave her the address, and for the first time in months, Isabella felt a flicker of something she had almost given up on. She felt a spark of hope. Leo Vance worked out of a nondescript office in a dated strip mall, a world away from the glass and steel towers of Miami's financial district. The paint was peeling from the sign, the windows were tinted dark, and a cheap security camera was aimed at the door. Isabella knocked. A moment later, the door was pulled open a few inches. Leo looked to be in his late 50s, but the stress had aged him, carving deep lines into his face and leaving a permanent weariness in his eyes. "You're Isabella Rossi," he said. It was a statement, not a question. "I am. Come on in." The inside of the office was an organized horde. Every inch of wall space was lined with filing cabinets, shelves of document boxes, and thick, color-coded binders. It looked less like an office and more like the private obsession of a man who had been preparing for war for over a decade. "I've been waiting for this for a very long time," Leo said, leading Isabella through a narrow path into a cramped workspace. "Waiting for someone else to figure out what she really is. Someone who could actually do something with what I have. What is all this?" Leo gestured at the boxes choking the room. "Everything. Every dirty deal Victoria ever made. Every politician she bought. Every competitor she blackmailed. I spent 5 years of my life tracking her after she ruined me. I documented it. I organized it. I made it ready. Ready for what?" "For this," Leo said quietly, pulling a heavy binder off a shelf and sliding it across a desk toward Isabella. "For someone with the power to use it." Isabella opened the binder. It was far more than just financial records. It was a complete blueprint of Victoria's methods, filled with transcripts of secret recordings, blackmail material, and detailed plans for corporate sabotage. "Why didn't you ever take this to the authorities?" she asked. "I tried." Leo's voice was sharp with old anger. "They were either too compromised to touch her or too incompetent to understand the evidence. Victoria has a network of allies, people in places you would never imagine. Every time I got close, my proof would disappear into a black hole. She branded me as an unstable, vengeful ex-contractor. So you just stopped?" "I survived," Leo corrected, his face hardening. "There's a big difference. I burned through all my money, and nobody with any power would back my story. But I kept copies of everything, waiting for a person with more influence, more capital, and a bigger reason to bring her down to finally show up." Isabella thought of her family's legacy, her father's life's work, her child on the way. "I have a reason," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Then take it," Leo urged, pushing the binder toward her again. "All of it. Use every last page, and make that monster answer for what she's done." Isabella spent the next 48 hours committing every detail of Victoria's treachery to memory. The sheer audacity of his betrayal was astonishing. She had uncovered a pattern of corporate espionage that threatened to ruin not just their family, but the entire company he'd built. He had leaked proprietary algorithms to a direct competitor, a woman Amelia now knew by name. He had funneled company funds into a secret side project with her, disguising the transfers as vendor payments. He had systematically lied for over a year, risking the careers of hundreds of employees. And he had almost gotten away with it. But this was a new equation. This time, Amelia held a variable Julian had never anticipated. She had a brother who was a partner at the top intellectual property law firm in Silicon Valley. She had a godfather on the board of directors, and she had a complete, unalterable data log of his every transgression. Amelia placed the first call. It was to her brother, David. I know Julian's firm threatened you with a conflict of interest suit to get you to back off the patent case last year, Amelia said. They did. David's voice was tight with remembered frustration. Their counsel buried us in paperwork and baseless claims until we had to recuse. Amelia, you have no idea the kind of scorched earth tactics he uses. I'm beginning to, she replied, her voice firm. I'm not asking you to file a lawsuit, not yet. I'm asking for your guidance. Entirely off the record. No paper trail, no billable hours. A beat of silence passed. What are you planning to do? I'm going to dismantle Julian Vance's legacy, the same way he tried to dismantle our future, she stated. By building a case so technologically perfect, Amelia ran a hand over the smooth, curved wood of the crib, a soft smile playing on her lips. At 8 months pregnant, her world had become this room, a sanctuary of muted blues and warm whites overlooking San Francisco Bay. Her husband, Julian, was the visionary behind their curated life. As a titan in the cutthroat world of artificial intelligence, he promised a future of seamless, data-driven perfection. It's the final beta version, he'd said, gesturing to the sleek, glowing orb that had been delivered that morning. The Aura Sphere. It's a predictive domestic AI. It learns our habits, manages the home, everything. Only the best for you and our son. She had smiled, touching his arm. The best is what you build. Julian was a man who lived on the bleeding edge of technology, and he insisted their home, and by extension, their family, be the ultimate showcase for his creations. Now, surrounded by unassembled baby furniture, Amelia decided to configure the Aura Sphere, a gift he'd presented as a way to simplify their lives. The setup was intuitive, designed for a user fluent in his tech ecosystem. It asked for a primary developer account to sync its core machine learning protocols. She entered Julian's main work email, the one he used for all his top-tier projects, assuming it held the highest level permissions. A gentle chime confirmed the link was active. She began organizing tiny swaddles in a dresser, as the Aura quietly parsed terabytes of data in the background. A few minutes later, her laptop, now synced to the new home AI, dinged with an unusual notification. Not an email, not a calendar alert. It was a raw data log summary. Daily transcript and biometric analysis. Amelia felt a prickle of confusion. She opened the file, thinking it was a system test. A new interface appeared, showing a timeline of the last 24 hours. It was a transcription, time-stamped, labeled with only a set of the initials. The entry was for KT. A sudden, chilling dread washed over her. Who was KT? Her mind raced as her curiosity morphed into a sickening certainty. She began navigating the other newly synced data streams on her laptop. One was an advanced geolocation log, part of the Aura's predictive travel feature. Julian was supposedly in Palo Alto for a 2-day AI ethics summit. But the log showed his car had never gone south of the city. It had been parked for the last 19 hours in the private underground garage of a luxury Nob Hill hotel. The same hotel mentioned in the KT transcript, the data points connected with cold, irrefutable logic. The data was a blueprint of a secret life, a series of encrypted chats he'd called Project Nightingale. But the Aura's log, now fully accessible, told a different story. For KT, always. The phrase appeared in a deleted draft. It corresponded perfectly with his angel investment trip to Zurich. For over a year, he had been living a lie. Every falsehood was a line of code in the perfect reality he'd programmed for her, and now A single bug was causing the whole system to crash. The same obsessive attention to detail she had once admired had just become the architect of their downfall. When Julian walked into their Pacific Heights apartment that evening, smelling of expensive whiskey instead of the sterile air of a conference room, he found her in the nursery. He was beaming, placing his messenger bag by the door. "The Series C funding is secured," he announced, moving to kiss her. "We just became the most valuable AI startup on the planet." Amelia didn't move. She just watched him, her expression unreadable. "How was the ethics summit?" she asked, her voice dangerously calm. "Exhausting," he lied, the words sliding out with effortless charm. "But worth it. I just kept thinking about the future we're building for the three of us." "That's strange," Amelia said, her voice barely a whisper, "because according to the Aura log, you weren't at a summit at all." She turned her tablet in her hands to face him. On the screen, a sound wave visualization pulsed gently. "The device is so helpful, it confirmed the location and even transcribed the entire conversation." Julian's triumphant smile evaporated. The blood drained from his face as he stared at the damning evidence on the screen, his well-rehearsed narratives failing him for the very first time. That's a deepfake," he stammered, his hand twitching as if to grab the tablet. "Corporate espionage, Amelia, that's all." "Is this espionage too?" She swiped to a new screen, showing a financial ledger from a hidden crypto wallet she didn't recognize. The recipient was a holding company. The amounts transferred corresponded to dates from the Aura's log. She met his gaze. "You expensed one trip to the board, Julian. So tell me, who is KT?" The initials echoed in the silent nursery, a query he could not answer. He opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. The tech visionary, the man who could sell the future to the world, was completely speechless. "Your new funding round is about to fall apart. Your investors are getting nervous. What could you possibly have that we would want?" David reached into his briefcase and placed a single hard drive on the polished table. "Project Chimera," David said coolly. "Your neural network initiative, 2022. The source code you stole from that Stanford startup." Julian's lawyer shifted uncomfortably. "The Sentinel Project. Your predictive policing software, 2023. The biased training data you knowingly used to secure the city contract." The lawyer's face tightened. "And Kendra Thorne, your rival at Apex Innovations, 2024. The trade secrets you shared with her in a hotel room." David leaned in, his voice dropping. "We have everything. Every line of code, every encrypted chat, every promise you broke to get ahead." For the first time, Julian's unflappable composure cracked. David saw a flicker of raw fear in his eyes. "I found the lead programmer from the Stanford team," David continued. "Remember him? The one you buried under a non-disclosure agreement and non-compete clause. The one you thought you'd silenced forever." "Whatever he's claiming," Julian's lawyer interjected, his voice strained, "is baseless. It's a shakedown, a disgruntled former contractor. It will never hold up in court." "That's where you're wrong," David said, a faint smile on his lips. "He kept his own repository, forked from the original build, with time-stamped commits and notes detailing every single module you stole. Data that can't be deleted or denied." Julian stood motionless in the nursery, surrounded by the beta test hardware of a life now offline. Motion-sensing nightlights cast a soft glow on the smart crib. The aura sphere on the changing table, synced to his cloud, pulsed with a gentle blue light. A silent monument to the invention that had ruined him. He hadn't been taken down by a market competitor or an investigative reporter, but by his own creation, the obsession with seamless integration he was once so proud of. The irony was suffocating. He'd built an empire on lines of code and predictive models, promising a future free of human error. Now, his own human failings had been logged with algorithmic precision, erasing the only future that ever truly mattered. He glanced around the room at the climate-controlled bassinet, the AI-powered baby monitor, the glowing orb that had recorded his betrayal. It was a smart home of his own design, and he was trapped inside. 2 weeks later, Amelia met her brother for coffee in Hayes Valley. The neighborhood was alive with energy, a world away from the sterile silence of her apartment. "The first settlement meeting is over," Amelia said, stirring honey into her latte. His lawyer tried to frame the affair as a high-stress response to the pressures of the funding round. Her brother laughed, a short, sharp sound. "He's lucky you didn't just forward the entire RA data log to the SEC." "Model. I thought about it," Olivia confessed, a weary smile touching her lips. "But it wasn't necessary. The proof was all digital, encrypted, and undeniable. My brother calls it a flawless data log of premeditated betrayal with clear-cut asset misappropriation." She took a slow sip of her water. Marcus built the perfect firewall around his lies, and in the end, it created a perfect record of the truth he was trying to hide. Gazing out at the bay, she placed a hand on her stomach, feeling the gentle stir of a new beginning. The tech empire Marcus had built was gone, but she remained. She and her child would code their own future now. That night, in their sprawling minimalist apartment, Olivia entered Marcus's home office. As she walked in, the smart lighting he was so proud of sensed her presence and bathed the room in a soft, ambient glow. A holographic display on the wall shimmered to life, showing the pre-market futures for his company's IPO. For a moment, her breath caught in her throat. The seamless technology was a constant, humming reminder of the life they had built together. Then, she took a deep breath, walked to his glass desk, and with a series of quiet clicks, began transferring the files. A new server, a new encryption key, a new life, entirely her own. The halt of the IPO was the lead story on every financial news network. Tech bloggers, frustrated investors, and the simply curious watched the drama unfold online. Olivia sat on her couch, her expression calm as the SEC spokesperson read the official statement. The Vance Capital public offering was suspended indefinitely, citing evidence of securities fraud and gross ethical misconduct. Marcus was shown being escorted from the NASDAQ floor by regulators, a phantom in a bespoke suit. His signature confidence was gone, replaced by a vacant, shocked expression. As his legal team rushed him away, his eyes found the camera. Olivia felt no pity, no surge of victory. She simply held that gaze on the screen, a silent observer, until he was gone. He would have the rest of his life to contemplate the kingdom he had deleted. He would remember the evening he sold her on the IPO as their family's legacy, the woman carrying his son, while he was wiring seed money to fund his mistress's startup. That was Olivia's victory. That was her justice. Her brother, Liam, waited until the SEC investigation was unsealed before making his move. His first stop was the Palo Alto office of Gavin Price, Marcus's high-powered attorney. The lawyer met him in the lobby, looking 10 years older than Liam remembered. The professional fallout had been catastrophic after the fraud became public. Gavin had been forced into an indefinite leave of absence by his firm and was now toxic. In the very Silicon Valley circles he had once dominated. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice tight, "I don't believe we have anything to discuss." "Oh, I'm sure we do." Liam walked past him into a vacant meeting room. "You were aware of Marcus's shell companies. You helped him structure the fraudulent seed funding. When your own paralegals raised red flags, you had them reassigned. An attorney's job is to advise. A partner's duty is to the firm. You betrayed them both." Liam placed a sleek data slate on the glass table. This is the complete forensic image of Marcus's private server. It documents, in painstaking detail, how the brilliant Gavin Price enabled a multi-million-dollar fraud. You actively concealed his crimes and conspired to silence the people who questioned him. You can't use this, Gavin whispered, his face losing all color. It's already been sent to the state bar. I also took the liberty of funding a new fellowship for digital ethics at Stanford Law School. As it turns out, their first major publication is a case study on the intersection of venture capital and investor fraud. Your name is cited extensively. Gavin stared, looking as if the floor had vanished from under him. You taught Marcus that regulations were for other people, Liam said. Now you get to learn what happens when the truth is the only term that matters. He left without a second glance. Gavin Price listed his Atherton home for sale by the end of the month. He moved to a state where no one knew his name. The second visit was to Marcus. Liam found him at his now empty office, coordinating the liquidation of Vance Capital. He took a seat in a guest chair, observing the hollowed-out man who once believed he could disrupt the world. If you came to gloat, Marcus said, his voice empty, I came so you understand one thing. Liam leaned forward, his voice low and precise. The last thing Olivia felt before her life imploded was the pure joy of your son kicking. She was mapping out your future as a family while you were signing the lease on a condo for another woman, all while she was on mandated bed rest, while her doctors were fighting to keep her stable, begging her to avoid stress. I didn't know the investment was fraudulent, Marcus argued weakly. You didn't care. That's infinitely worse. You saw Olivia's panicked texts. You saw her string of missed calls. You knew something was wrong, and you switched your phone to airplane mode so you could rehearse your IPO speech with your mistress. A sheen of moisture filled Marcus's eyes, the first real emotion Liam had seen from him. Your fund is dismantled, Liam said flatly. Your assets are seized. Your lawyer is about to be disbarred. You're facing a decade, maybe more, in prison. He stood from the chair, straightening his jacket. But here's the sentence that will last forever. Every single time you close your eyes, you will see her terrified messages. You will hear her voice from the calls you ignored. And you will know, with absolute clarity, that you could have answered, but you chose to be with her instead. Liam turned and walked toward the exit. Marcus was now openly weeping, raw, broken sounds echoing in the empty office. Live with that, Liam said, without looking back. Forever. The door clicked shut. His final visit was to Chloe. She'd been released on bail and was confined to her apartment. 15 years, minimum, for conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The feds weren't offering a deal. She would be middle-aged and forgotten by the time she got out. Liam sat across from her at her small kitchen table, watching her sad attempt to project confidence. She wore a stained hoodie, her designer clothes a distant memory, her sharp haircut now grown out and messy. The mask was gone. You think you've won, she sneered. I know I have. I have a long career ahead of me. I have a network. You have an ankle monitor and a court-appointed lawyer. Liam pushed a small, encrypted drive across the table. Every venture capitalist you ever pitched has just received a file detailing your entire history of corporate deception. Every contact who thought you were a visionary has been given definitive proof of your fraud. Every offshore crypto wallet you thought was untraceable has been flagged and frozen. There has to be some other way, Chloe murmured, her voice cracking. There isn't. Liam stood up. You targeted my family because you saw my sister as an obstacle, a line item in your plan to get a billion-dollar valuation. He leaned forward, his voice a quiet, dangerous whisper. You made a fatal miscalculation. I'm the guy who spent a decade in cybersecurity, and my focus is Absolute. He turned to leave. Enjoy your trial. Miss, I will personally ensure that every year of your sentence is as lonely as you made my sister feel when she learned the truth. He left her there as she finally realized there was no exit strategy. No one left to call, no way out. There was only the price for what she'd done. 2 months later, Olivia was in an examination room, looking at the obstetrician, who had just delivered another piece of stunning news. Congratulations, the doctor said with a brilliant smile. You're having twins. Based on my measurements, you're about 18 weeks along. Olivia's hand flew to her stomach. A tsunami of shock washed over her, then disbelief, then a profound sense of clarity that took her breath away. 2.5 months. The timeline slammed into her. That meant it was from before the scandal erupted. The telehealth doctor confirmed it, gently over the laptop screen. Yes, Amelia. Based on those dates, you conceived before your husband's company collapsed. Amelia felt the air leave her lungs, trapped in a silent whirlwind. A baby. A life had been quietly forming inside her, even as her own was being torn apart. It represented a future she hadn't dared to consider. Her mind raced, connecting the dots. It was possible. The last time she and Marcus were together, before the articles were published, before she learned about his affair and the fraud, this child was a tangible, breathing link to the life she thought was gone forever. Amelia, are you all right? The doctor's voice came through the speaker, noticing her stunned silence. You seem to be in shock. I am, Amelia managed, a hollow laugh catching in her throat. This wasn't on my radar. The stress you've endured has been immense, the doctor said softly. If you need to talk about what's next? No, Amelia interrupted, her voice suddenly clear and strong. I want this baby, more than I've ever wanted anything. A warm smile spread across the doctor's face. In that case, let's book your first in-person appointment. We'll take wonderful care of you. Amelia drove to her father's townhouse in a fog. Arthur, a retired federal judge, was in his study, painstakingly restoring a vintage watch. His life was one of quiet, deliberate order. He saw the look on her face and immediately set his tools down. What happened? Arthur asked, his voice rough with worry. Amelia told him everything, the words tumbling out in a torrent of pain. When she was done, the retired judge was silent, his jaw set like granite. For a long moment, she saw the formidable prosecutor he used to be. Then, his hard expression cracked. A grandson, he murmured. The words barely a whisper. A new legacy. He pulled her into a fierce embrace, one that reminded her of being a little girl, believing her father could right any wrong in the world. This is our anchor, Amelia, he said into her hair. After all that deception, this is our truth. I know. She rested her head on his shoulder. I'm going to call him Phoenix. Phoenix, because that's what he represented. A new life rising from the ashes of the old one. A reason to fight. 5 months later, Amelia stood at the packed opening of her gallery's most personal exhibit, Reconstructions. The space, located in Boston's trendy SoWa art and design district, was buzzing with critics and patrons, all there to see the work born from her public heartbreak. Sunlight streamed through the massive industrial windows, illuminating the brick and beam interior. At the entrance, a small brass plaque was dedicated to her inspiration. Amelia placed a hand on her growing belly as she read it softly. For the muses of ruin and rebirth, the most powerful forces I have ever known. Arthur stood beside her, his pride in her a palpable presence. Chloe was there too, her best friend's victory finally at hand after a silent, bitter war. Their oldest family friend, David, had driven in from his vineyard in the Berkshires to see the beautiful new world she had sculpted from the wreckage. 4 people forged into a new family by betrayal and resilience. "You're going to have the most beautiful view of the world, little one," Amelia whispered to her stomach. "I'm naming you Phoenix because you are the light that came from the fire." "He would be so proud of the woman you've become," Arthur said. His voice was thick with emotion. "You never broke. I couldn't. I owed it to myself." Chloe squeezed her shoulder gently. "And now you have a completely clean canvas." Amelia nodded, a thoughtful look in her eyes. "Yes, but I'm painting it differently this time." "How so?" "Before, my life was a performance piece for someone else. For Richard, for the perfect power couple image I thought we were meant to be, for the future everyone expected of me." She glanced around the gallery, at her father, her best friend, and the man who was like an uncle to her. "This time, I'm creating for me, and for the child who taught me how to rise from the ashes, the one I had to let go of, and the one who is on his way." The opening had ended hours ago, but Amelia remained. She sat on a leather bench in the quiet gallery, watching the city lights of Boston begin to sparkle beyond the windows. Her father had gone home to rest. Chloe had left to file her triumphant review of the show. David had started the drive back to his winery, a profound calm having replaced the worry in his eyes. She was alone. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, her mind was still. She replayed the past year, the gut-wrenching discovery, Richard and Veronica, on all she had lost and all she was now building. "People say time heals all wounds," she mused, "but that's not quite it. Time just gives you the space to become a master of kintsugi, the art of mending what's broken with gold, making it more beautiful for having been shattered." Her hand came to rest on the firm curve of her belly, the most precious reconstruction of all. "I lost a baby," she whispered to the quiet gallery, "to the memory of a past sorrow. I lost a decade of my life. I lost myself in a marriage that was a beautiful, elaborate fake, but in its demolition, I found her, the artist I was always meant to be." She walked toward the exhibit's central installation, stopping beside a sculpture of shattered marble reassembled with veins of pure gold. "My father, the judge, always said, 'Justice isn't about revenge. It's about restoring balance. It's making sure the people who break the world don't get to own the pieces.'" She traced a golden seam with her finger. "Richard will have his name tarnished in every boardroom in this city. Veronica will spend the rest of her career trying to escape the shadow of being the other woman. And I get to create something real." She looked up at the ceiling, at the exposed 100-year-old beams. "This time, I'm not building my life to fit someone else's frame. I'm building it for me and for the 2 sons who made me a mother, the one I hold in memory and the one I hold now." She turned to leave, heading toward her apartment upstairs, toward her future. She paused at the door, taking one final look at her creation. "I'll miss you," she whispered, to the life she thought she wanted. Always. A nighthawk swooped low over the city streets, its wings catching the neon glow from the signs below. It banked sharply, a perfect silhouette of resilience, before disappearing into the urban canyon. Amelia watched it go, then with a peaceful smile she laid a hand on her belly and walked forward, into the life that was truly hers. 4 months later, on a bright, cold day in December, Amelia balanced Phoenix on her hip, pointing toward the Boston skyline visible through the gallery's massive windows. "See that tall, shiny building?" Amelia said. "That's where we make sure your big brother's memory inspires something beautiful. He was the bravest soul I've ever known." Phoenix babbled, pointing a tiny finger at a plane descending toward Logan Airport. Amelia laughed, kissing her son's soft hair. She thought of Richard, his career stalled, his brilliance now confined to a mid-level partnership at a second-tier firm. She thought of Veronica, who had quietly moved to a new city, her ambitions in Boston reduced to ash. She thought of her father,